Selling England by the pound.
Band. Genesis. Album. Selling England by the pound. Songs on the album. Song first, side 1. Dancing with the Moonlit Night. Song second, side 1. I Know What I Like, In Your Wardrobe. Song third, side 1. Firth of Fifth. Song fourth, side 1. More Fool Me. Side 2, Song first, side 2. The Battle of Epping Forest. Song second, side 2. After the Ordeal. Song third, side 2. The Cinema Show. Song fourth, side 2. Isle of Plenty. Release date, October 12, 1973. Recorded at Island Studios, London, August 1973. Producers, John Burns and Genesis. Assistant Engineer, Rhett Davies. Artwork, Betty Swanick, ARA. Band lineup. Phil Collins, drums, percussion, voices, lead voice on More Fool Me. Michael Rutherford, 12-string, bass, electric sitar. Stephen Hackett, electric guitar, nylon guitar. Tony Banks, keyboards, 12-string. Peter Gabriel, lead voice, flute, oboe, percussion. The making of album. Selling England by the pound. In late spring 1973, with the second American tour behind them, Genesis stopped performing live to concentrate on writing their fifth studio album. They rehearsed in the same two places they had used for Foxtrot. Una Billings School of Dance in Shepherd's Bush and a doctor's house in Chessington. Rutherford, most of it was written near Chessington. Phil had a friend with an apartment in a big, old country house there, and they had an area which bands could rent out. Hackett. I remember us rehearsing this album in a house that a family lived in, near Chessington Zoo. Of course, it was a totally inappropriate place because it had no soundproofing, and quite naturally the neighbors started to complain. I remember one woman coming in and saying, "You're just making banging noises, it's not music at all." Because it was a house that belonged to a family, it gave the music a sense of happy amateurishness. It made it fun because you felt you shouldn't really be there doing that kind of thing. It was designed as a canteen or a cafeteria. There was even a machine that used to dispense bubble gum for kids. The atmosphere was very different than a normal rehearsal space, and I think that helped put a smile into the music. It did for me anyway. And then there was Una Billings, which is where we wrote Foxtrot and Supper's Ready, another very eccentric place. The sound of these girls dancing upstairs was like elephants dancing, believe me. Imagine what it's like when you've got 20 of them all making this noise together. It was so funny, we used to look at each other. Whatever we were doing at that moment, no matter how serious it sounded, was crazy. While writing the album, the band had some difficulties coming up with ideas for songs. Banks, we used to have writing sessions. We didn't necessarily write the album all in one go, but I remember that on this particular record we were a bit stuck for ideas. There were 2 or 3 things we already had. For example, there was this riff Steve had been playing on stage and all over the place. We developed that into the song I Know What I Like. It was quite a simple thing for us really, but it had a very strong atmosphere. I had 3 bits I'd written which I originally assumed would go into different songs. As it is, they all ended up in the song which became Firth of Fifth. Basically, we just strung the 3 bits together in a way that made sense of them. Then there was the riff that became the first part of the Battle of Epping Forest. Other than that we didn't have much. We were struggling a bit to find things, so we ended up playing these 3 things every day for a long time and kind of overworked them, particularly Epping Forest. We got way too many ideas into that. Collins, speaking in 2007. Some people see this as a difficult album to make. I don't particularly remember it being that way. I do remember the Chessington sessions when we came up with Cinema Show and Dancing with the Moonlit Night. Some of the instrumental stuff is me and Steve. I was starting to listen to the Mahavishnu Orchestra, so I was trying to put my weird time signatures into anything that would move. I Know What I Like, which we wrote at Una Billings, was us doing our Beatles thing, really. We didn't see any harm in that because we had yet to have a hit single. I know Tony has said he could have done without Isle of Plenty. Firth of Fifth was a big tour de force, while Cinema Show was a huge tour de force. It's got a lot of things in it that we still play.
It became a huge stage classic and I particularly like it. I think the first half is great. We were definitely starting to sound a little bit better in the studio. Rutherford, it wasn't until Hugh Padgham came along, not until 1981, that the band on record really started to sound like it did in the rehearsal room. At the time we used to have a good sound both live and in the rehearsal room, but in the studio we were always trying to get it back up to how it should be. The drums always sounded small on the record, but not live. Gabriel, very often people would come in with ideas that were starting points and then they would sort of get to be the captain of that song. Some things, on the other hand, emerged during band rehearsals. So it was a sort of dual approach. Banks, we always felt that our strongest moments seemed to come out of us all improvising and jamming with things just coalescing. We always liked that very much, it's what gives you the thrill. Hackett, I think we were given 6 weeks to write an album and 6 weeks to record it at this point. We used to think anything else was excessive. With this album we were all working together as a group trying to write as much as possible face to face in the studio. Obviously Tony brought in Firth of Fifth as a finished song himself. The first part of Dancing with the Moonlit Night was Pete's and then it became everybody's. I Know What I Like started as a guitar riff of mine. The rest we all did together. For the guitarist, these writing sessions became a place of refuge. Hackett, at the time my first marriage was in bad shape. When I was at home I was finding it very hard to write because the atmosphere was tense. I just turned up for the rehearsals of this album with lots of guitar riffs, so it turned into a very guitar-y album. I was talking to Anthony Phillips about this recently. He liked the album a lot. He was very generous about it considering he was my predecessor. He said to me, "You did exactly the right thing bringing in all these riffs, because if you tried to bring complete songs into Genesis it didn't always work. Unless you were Tony Banks, that is. Tony basically got his way more than anybody else. It's a fact." That said, he came up with wonderful things, and it was both wonderful and terrible working with him. For this album the band had a much larger array of instruments and effects at their disposal. Hackett, I already had my volume pedal and my fuzz box and I had this thing called an Echoplex which could do tape echo with a movable head. We used it on the vocals to I Know What I Like to make the voices go all wobbly, and it meant that, live, the guitar could sound like a studio recording. I didn't know any other bands that were using that, so we were state-of-the-art at that point. We also had everything that a Mellotron could do. Tony had got hold of a monophonic synth. That was something I pushed for because I was always very keen on enlarging what the keyboards could do, having a wider palette to draw from. The more tone colors, the better. Banks, I would put the Hammond organ through fuzz boxes and things. I'd try using one drawbar or just the percussion sound. I'd be trying to get every little thing you could possibly get out of it. I'd be using 100% of the instrument, whereas now, with the modern synthesizer, you probably use only 1/2%. A lot of people just switch it on and use presets and that's all they ever do. Mellotrons were great in the sense that they gave you these lovely string and voice sounds and everything, but you couldn't play fast on them. When synthesizers came in, they just opened up the keyboard world so much. I had this ARP Pro Soloist, a very simple monophonic synthesizer, which had a nice little range of tones on it. You didn't have to do any programming, it was just preset sounds. Cinema Show was very much based on that instrument, but I used it on little bits and pieces throughout the album. It was a really interesting addition to the armory I already had: organ, piano, mellotron. Having something alternative to play lead keyboards on suddenly opened up possibilities for me. When the time came to decide which tracks were to go on the album, a series of arguments within the band occurred. Tony detested After the Ordeal, Steve and Peter thought the keyboard solo in Cinema Show was too long. In the end, to avoid upsetting anyone, they came to a compromise and decided to keep everything, which might explain why this is a particularly long album. Hackett, The Battle of Epping Forest is very long and took that side of the album up to around 29 minutes. People didn't do that in those days because it meant you could get less bass response. We had arguments about what should and what shouldn't be included, but I'm very glad we left everything in. The album. In August 1973, Genesis went into the studio to record the album with the help of John Burns, the sound engineer who had worked with them on Foxtrot and was now promoted to CO producer. As for past albums, Genesis made use of some pre-existing ideas which developed into more definitive versions in the rehearsal room. The continuous creative growth of the whole band, including the two latest additions who were by this time fully integrated members, was accompanied by their ability to improvise freely and intuitively. From a writing point of view, with the exception of Firth of Fifth and More Fool Me, all the other songs came about as a result of collective interaction between the whole band or units made up of at least 2 or 3 members. Set against the early parts of Dancing with the Moonlit Night, written entirely by Gabriel, and reprised in the last track Isle of Plenty, is the collective instrumental section written mainly by Steve, Phil, and Tony. Steve wrote the underlying riff for I Know What I Like, but this was only shaped into a song thanks to Peter's verse and Tony's chorus. The Battle of Epping Forest is a juxtaposition between Tony's music, written with the help of Mike in the intermediate sections, and Peter's expressive singing. After the Ordeal is an instrumental track written by Steve incorporating a section written by Mike, while Cinema Show is divided into 2 sections. The first acoustic part was written by Mike, while the second electric part came about from a jamming session between Mike, Phil, and Tony. In terms of lyrics, however, Gabriel definitely had the upper hand. Besides the mellifluous love song More Fool Me, Tony and Mike worked together, without much success, on the lyrics for Firth of Fifth and Cinema Show, leaving their lead singer to pen the words to Dancing with the Moonlit Night, I Know What I Like, The Battle of Epping Forest and Isle of Plenty, authentic works of genius and verbal agility. Gabriel's lyrical prowess was head and shoulders above many of his contemporaries, and not just from within the band. Drawing his inspiration from things such as newspaper articles, as he had done previously with The Return of the Giant Hogweed, his writing comes across as both refined and sophisticated. In this album, the usual references to mythology and literature are relegated to a marginal role, albeit still present, in favor of historical references and social comment. In an intertwining and exquisitely English play on words, the lyrics form the framework of the most British album Genesis ever wrote thanks to the fantastic descriptive identity of the characters who would later come to life on stage. Paradoxically, when more or less individual compositions were being written, although the songs were, as always, credited to the whole group, Selling England by the Pound turns out to be the first Genesis record which could realistically be credited 20% to each member. While the first 2 albums were created by the work of 2 songwriter pairs, Banks Gabriel on the one side and Phillips Rutherford on the other, and Nursery Crime and Foxtrot essentially represented the primary compositional fusion between Banks and Rutherford with the support of Gabriel and contributions from the newcomers, just a little from Hackett and even less from Collins. Selling England by the Pound is the album where Genesis achieved a perfect creative balance for the first time ever. What's more, during the recording sessions a special kind of synergy developed between Tony and the rhythm section, Phil and Mike, the trio which would later go on to constitute the second and more commercially successful phase in the band's history. In a group where, apart from for the more instinctive Steve and Phil, the idea of improvising had been a totally foreign concept. The three developed an enviable level of understanding, with Tony acting as the driving force and inventor of original melodies driven by fantastic and creative rhythms. The most striking case, a precursor of which was seen in Apocalypse in 9/8, is the long instrumental section in Cinema Show. Maybe due to this sense of unity, despite the initial difficulties, Selling England by the Pound, although preceded by 3 extraordinary albums, is often considered Genesis' real coming of age. The band's evolution continued to follow a logical and seemingly unstoppable thread. From Genesis to Revelation contained the first frail attempts at songwriter, while Trespass revealed the band's progressive side, despite it still being closely linked to folk influences thanks to Anthony's and Mike's 12-string guitar parts. Where Nursery Crime suffers from a lack of synergy within the new lineup, with the band having changed 2 of its 5 members, Foxtrot turned out to be a successful album by what had by then become a consolidated and technically skillful band. The artistic standing of Selling England by the Pound, on the other hand, is all the more brilliant at a time when progressive rock seemed to have already reached its peak and was about to go into decline. In fact, the new records released in 1973 by Genesis' most reputable counterparts all showed a marked change in direction. Albums such as Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon or King Crimson's Lark's Tongues in Aspic, while undoubtedly representing milestones in the history of rock, both unequivocally show that these bands were already moving beyond their purely progressive phase. Floyd, it has to be said, had barely touched upon it with metal. Whereas the return of King Crimson, a couple of years after their first breakup, indicates a much harder direction, with their romantic moments reduced to a mere flicker. And then there were the other prog giants, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, with their passable brain salad surgery, and yes, with their heavy-going Tales from Topographic Oceans, along with the equally indigestible The Six Wives of Henry VIII, Rick Wakeman's solo album, confirm that delusions of grandeur had hijacked the musical genre, which seemed to be merely running its course and becoming increasingly unpalatable, while in the field of prog folk, Jethro Tull, with their pretentious passion play, got slated by the critics. The odd innovative spark did appear, albeit from unexpected sources. If Tubular Bells by the phenomenal Mike Oldfield remains an isolated case, the fusion found in Birds of Fire by the Mahavishnu Orchestra represented, according to Collins and Hackett, a source of inspiration for Genesis in this era, while the electronic experimentation in No Puss-Footing by Fripp and Eno would leave its mark on Genesis just a year later. In the meantime, glam rock, to which Gabriel's theatricality has been unfairly likened, was still at its height, with David Bowie's Aladdin Sane, Roxy Music's For Your Pleasure, Gary Glitter's Touch Me and Tanks by T-Rex. In this artistic scenario, Selling England by the Pound became the perfect progressive rock album, the maximum level to which any band in this sector could aspire at that time. It has to be said that the album is lacking in opus, such as the musical box or Supper's Ready. On the other hand, the musicality of the band is seen to be open to more diverse influences than ever before. At the end of the day, only Firth of Fifth and the instrumental section in Cinema Show can be considered classic progressive rock. The rest of the album reveals alternating disparate influences whose roots are to be found not only in Europe, folk and Baroque, but also on the other side of the Atlantic, jazz rock, West Coast. In the midst of all this lie the seeds of pop, planted in a compositional soil which would soon prove to be very fertile. At this point, however, one question remains: how would the band follow up this masterpiece? The songs on the album, Selling England by the Pound. Side A, Song First, Dancing with the Moonlit Night. This song is essentially divided into 3 sections: an acoustic opening, with the a cappella introduction by Gabriel, who wrote the whole melody, an audacious instrumental, created by band improvisation, and a final section with a delicate atmosphere. Gabriel, there was a growing sense of confidence in this track, which I started off writing. I was trying to get a folk reference, you know, to protect and preserve some of the Englishness. In the opening part, I was particularly trying to capture something that had more references to Henry VIII than to American song music. Hackett, when it starts out you really don't know where the song is going to go. There was this melody 22 seconds which Pete wrote on piano and mainly becomes a guitar figure throughout the song. It was someone else's melody interpreted on guitar in two different ways. Banks, I like the way it starts very much, but it's not my favorite song, although I know a lot of people really like it. It's a slightly weaker track for me. Hackett, I love the fact that the album starts off with Pete singing on his own, something that was influenced by Scottish plain song, in other words songs that were sung without any accompaniment, like a man standing in the wind just singing in the open with a few stragglers, just the elements to carry his word on the wind or in the rain. So it starts off with that bleakness, that starkness, almost like a song with no furniture, sparse, bereft of support. And then it becomes a romantic reflection on the state of England selling off its history which moves quite naturally into the fusion that we associate more with the American influence. Gabriel, we were attempting to mix some traditional folk elements with more contemporary band arrangements. Even the color of the voice I was using at the time was folk influenced. In the opening part it was fairly easy to get a mood going, but once the band kicked off, that transition was quite awkward. I probably remember it more from playing it live than from the record. It was a very effective shift in gear. Rutherford, I think the first part of the song was great, whereas the Moonlit Night bit 2 minutes 22 seconds was okay but a bit busy. The central section is notable for its variety of instrumentation. Banks not only plays piano but also organ, mellotron, and some individual synth phrases. Rutherford plays 12-string and bass, while Hackett passes from the nylon guitar to electric, where he gives us his famous tapping sequence, 2 minutes 35 seconds. Hackett, it was the fastest a guitarist had ever played. You couldn't play that fast with regular picking, but with this tapping technique, using the nail, you could play phenomenally fast. In the instrumental part we had mellotron and guitar which together sounded like a brass section. It's almost like classical fusion, and then you get guitar and piano ensemble playing. In the finale, the atmosphere suddenly rounds back on itself, becoming repetitive and yet evocative, 6 minutes 17 seconds. Collins, I'd forgotten all about that bit until recently when someone played it to me. It was being used in a documentary and I asked where it came from. It goes a bit like clockwork. You know, like a wind-up clock. Sometimes you forget about these little bits that actually could have been the beginning of something else. Hackett. The noises in the background are Peter playing the oboe reed to make it sound like ducks. Everybody was improvising except for one fixed part, which was Mike Rutherford on the 12-string. We used to call this the Disney section because we thought it sounded like a cartoon. Classical musicians would call it a tone poem, really, because it creates pictures. Often this is used on television even now in England, normally to do with nature programs. It somehow makes you think of the natural world. It's like a meditation on a lake. I find it very English sounding. We always used to improvise it, so every time we played it, it came out different. I don't find it too long. Gabriel's lyrics contrast the decadence of Old England and its progressive Americanization, as highlighted by the reference to the wimpy Barberger chain. It is packed with historical and social references exploiting very clever wordplay, like the union of uniform and fawn to create Unifawn, the Queen of Maybe, or the Citizens of Hope and Glory to mimic the patriotic song, Land of Hope and Glory. Gabriel, the lyrics were, in a sense, about the commercialization of English culture. Even we were selling ourselves to foreign audiences, including the Americas. One of the aims of the record was to look at Englishness in a different way, and therefore the title Selling England by the Pound seemed like a good title for the album. So that was my recommendation. Rutherford, I think it's one of our best album titles actually. Selling England by the Pound is a great phrase. On stage, with that sort of headgear thing, Peter looked like the depiction of Britannia on the back of a coin. It was a great setting for the song. Side A song second, I Know What I Like, In Your Wardrobe. As a single, this was Genesis' first moderate success in the hit parade. It starts with a fixed synthesizer drone sound accompanied by an unusual rhythm from the bongos. Peter's spoken intro leads into the rather elementary structure of the song, a verse sung by two voices over an insistent riff played on electric guitar, Steve, and sitar, Mike, and a very catchy chorus characterized by a lovely bass guitar sequence. Hackett, this is a very simple song, of course. It's based on a guitar riff of mine. We were practicing this riff round about the time of Foxtrot. Phil and I used to play it all the time, but the rest of the guys in the band said it sounded a bit too much like the Beatles, so we didn't use it. When it came to the following album, Phil and I were still playing it together, only this time the rest of the band joined in and the song was written from a jam. Rutherford, we grew up with the Beatles. The best band in the world. This word pop has come to mean something different now, but a great song is a great song. Although our writing wasn't bad at all, there were different pieces in our songs. I suppose I Know What I Like was one of the first songs where we actually managed to take a short, simple idea and develop it rather than having, as we often did, too many small bits in a song. Quite unusually, the song is sung entirely by Peter and Phil together. Hackett, when it came to the mix, I remember Pete wanted to make it a single line and not have Phil's harmony on it. I insisted on it having the two voices because that's what makes it more immediate. It just seemed to me that it wasn't strong enough for a single line, but when it was a double, it became stronger than the sum of the parts. What really makes the song work is what we were all doing, the crazy percussion that's going on, filling up milk bottles and running drumsticks along them, all that tingly stuff that people became fond of, that's what really makes it work. And the drone right at the beginning, everybody is playing that and it's slowed down to half speed, and I think some of it might be backwards as well, because in those days guitars didn't sustain long enough. I could get a great sound with an octave divider and a fuzz box, but then the sound would run out, it would go for a while and then just stop. At half speed we were able to re-trigger things and make it work. Gabriel, although it may have looked as if there was more of a pop sensibility on this record, I think I Know What I Like was in part an accident. Often, when we tried to chase things, we'd fail miserably. I think we'd got to a point where we'd learnt that when we were ourselves and allowed things to happen, we seemed to have more success and resonance with audiences than if we tried to write something which none of us really felt was true to the core of the band. Hackett, sometimes you've just got to be tenacious, you've got to be stubborn and stick to your guns. I remember joking to journalists saying, you should hear our latest hit single, as if it were a done deal, but I was just joking. When it did become a hit, I was thrilled, of course. It was years before the band had another one. Banks, we always loved pop songs, you know, and even though we're always associated with being a heavy progressive group, we came into the business writing pop songs. We were really pleased that we'd actually written one that we thought was pretty good and probably would have been quite a big hit if it hadn't had this wardrobe in the title, which no one could understand. It was a really nice sort of effect, you know. We developed the chorus very well, it was very strong. Gabriel, I never really loved the chorus, it was one of Tony's melodies and after a while I got very bored of it. But it was fun playing the sort of jerkier and jumpier melodies of the verse with Phil. The lyrics certainly weren't conventional pop lyrics. Again, I think I was trying to explore what lurked beneath the surface. As confirmed by the album liner notes included with the original release, the lyrics were inspired by a painting by Betty Swanwick called The Dream, which, with the later addition of a lawnmower, went on to become the album cover. The main character in the story is Jacob, apparently a good-for-nothing who gets comfort from mowing the lawn, but whose identity isn't very clear, as in the concluding phrase, steeped in deliciously British surrealism, the words seem to be talking about a lawnmower rather than a human being who mowed lawns. Side A song third, Firth of Fifth. Banks, I'd written a piece for Foxtrot which had this piano bit that ended up as the introduction to Firth of Fifth. I was quite excited about it, but the others less so. I carried on working on the idea and wrote a piece I thought sounded really good on its own, and that, if I could swing it by the rest of them, I could do it as an introduction. We'd done Horizons, so I thought the idea of letting one person just do a bit was acceptable. Hackett, there's something almost religious about Tony's famous introduction. It's a cross between gospel, blues, and classical. There have been suggestions that the piano solo was influenced by mathematical theory and specifically Fibonacci's golden ratio, but this was not the case. Banks, I wasn't thinking about mathematics for the introduction. I didn't worry about time signatures because with those runs of arpeggios and 4s and 3s, you can always follow it without it being a strict time signature, so I just let it take me where it wanted. It wasn't a particularly difficult thing to write, although I wasn't quite sure how to use it. The body of the song develops with verses and riffs repeated twice, with Hackett doubling the notes of the bass. Hackett, the bass and the guitar playing together creates this idea, it's almost like brass and organ together. And just about every time we played it, it sounded good. The fact that you could see the bass line descending makes it similar to Baroque music and Bach. Between the first and second verse there is a variation in melody followed by vocal harmonies. Hackett, at 2 minutes and 14 seconds, its volume pedal for guitar with echo. Although I wasn't around for the actual recording of the voices, I think they were speeded up to sound higher than they actually were. The long instrumental section is preceded by swooping guitar, from 3 minutes and 4 seconds, which Hackett achieved with a slide volume pedal, some repeat echo and some reverb as well. The main theme is played by Gabriel on the flute, then by Banks on synthesizer, and finally Steve's guitar solo comes in. Collins, we were steamrollered into fourth of fifth, but it worked. Tony was good at that and still is. When someone comes in with something and it's full of odd time signatures and odd bar lengths with a few speed up and a few slow downs, it's a drummer's nightmare. You go, oh my god, how am I gonna play this and make it sound natural? But that's what we did. He came in with this fully composed thing which we ended up doing as he wrote it. We didn't record a great version of it. I remember it was a bit wonky in the middle. I tried to correct it by putting a cabeza on it and it just made it worse. Rutherford, speaking in 2007, we're still playing a big section of it today. We're taking the main theme from the song and just letting it run for about 4 minutes with a lovely guitar solo playing the melody and some lines in between. We were starting to give the sections more space and more time to sit in one mood rather than move on too fast. Hackett, when what was the piano solo becomes the synth solo 4 minutes and 32 seconds, the rhythm section is doing all sorts of extraordinary things, with this furious punctuation behind it. I think a lot of bands, when they're trying to copy what they think is progressive music, they often spend too much time concentrating on the punctuation, without spending enough time on the statement. That's where I think Genesis scored because there was something to say with the song. The same applies to bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, you know, bands where you had to spot the time signature. How does that work? How does it link up? It rotates but you can't count it, you can't tap your foot to it. Banks, the way the guitar solo evolved is quite interesting really, because the second bit I'd written was really just a flute and piano melody, I mean that's how I saw it, but we played it live a few times and it sounded really nice. Then one time Steve started playing it and I thought it was great. I liked putting these big mellotron chords in, it was almost like a joke, and suddenly we were doing it a la King Crimson. So, for the reprise of that melody, when it came in the second half of the song, we decided to try and do it in this big way to see how it sounded. It worked really well, it gave a chance for Steve to actually do a proper guitar solo, basing it around the melodic line I'd written, but doing more with it. Hackett, I think we recorded this song edited into different parts, which is why the speed is different from one bit to another. When it came to doing the guitar solo, I tried to play Tony's melody and I thought if I bent the notes over it would sound more oriental, more exotic. I wasn't really trying to be a guitarist, I was pretending to play oboe or a reed instrument with the ability to be able to bend and sustain. Collins, the theme was something that Tony had written. You know, the actual beginning and the end of it. But what goes on in the middle, obviously, is Steve stretching out. I always felt that Steve was a better sound man than player. Back then I didn't think he was a particularly fluent player, that's not to say he isn't now. Hackett, originally Tony wrote this as a piano part, but then you never heard it as a piano part, it was always piano with flute or piano with guitar or organ with guitar or mellotron and guitar. Not only that, the piano melody was played on two synths. One is played at regular speed and the other one is played at half speed, so when it's brought back, you have 2 octaves. This sounds like typical progressive music to me, especially when you've got the drums doing this sort of punctuation along with the sound of Mike's bass, which was very Chris Squire influenced. When the guitar solo comes to an end, passing on to a major chord, 8 minutes, the interaction with the music is so strong as to evoke the calm after the storm. Hackett, I think it's very visual and descriptive, almost as if it comes after an area of trouble or something. Yes, very much the calm after the storm. I've always liked that in music, this contrast of moods, the intensity of the minor part which brings a bit of anguish perhaps, but there's something very majestic about the minor part as well. And the major part that follows is a little bit closer to Hendrix than it is to me. Banks, Steve had obviously always contributed, you know. A lot of Genesis music required acoustic guitar picking and stuff, which people notice less than a lead guitarist playing a solo. Steve was really starting to find his feet as a live player and everything, and I suppose on this it was more of a genuine guitar solo, some of the others he did were a bit more tricksy. You know, he was always thinking very hard about every note he played so nothing had soared in quite the way this does. I think he allowed himself to have a bit more freedom with it, particularly before the main melody starts where there are some really nice little phrases. 5 minutes and 45 seconds and it sounds more like a real guitarist. Hackett, it's the longest and best known electric guitar solo in Genesis history. I think in the early days of the band it wasn't always easy to find the appropriate moment to do electric guitar work. It wasn't a band that was blues-based like Eric Clapton with the Blues Breakers or Cream that were dominated by lead guitar work. As a band, Genesis was dominated by chord work, but it just seemed as if this was a glorious melody to interpret in this way, and I just happened to be the right man for the job at that time. I'm very proud of the way that guitar solo sounds even though I know it's not as perfect as I can do it today. The tuning isn't as good as it could have been. In those days I was overdubbing in headphones and we didn't have strobe tuners. Now, of course, in the age of studios that we own ourselves and with experience and technology, there is no excuse for anything going out of tune ever again. But in those days it was a band in the studio for a short time just going for it and trying to make it sound as good as possible. Gabriel, Steve had definitely gained in confidence. Firth of Fifth is very much a Tony piece in terms of how it started and how it's built, but Steve did let loose and I think probably in the best way right up to that point at the end. It was his coming-of-age album in a lot of ways. The title, in true early Genesis style, is a play on words. The Firth of Forth is an estuary, Firth, on the east coast of Scotland into which the River Forth flows. The lyrics, written by Tony and Mike, are not of the highest quality and swing in a muddled manner between mythology and numerous water-ocean references, waterfall, sea, undinal songs, river of constant change, which caused a certain measure of embarrassment to Peter and Phil when performing the song in later years. Side A, Song 3rd, More Fool Me. Written by Mike and Phil while sitting on the steps outside Island Recording Studios, this track is the first in a series of simple, some might say cheesy, songs which would appear much more frequently in later stages of the band's history. Rutherford plays the 12-string with a lot of reverb while Collins sings, mainly in falsetto, the banal lyrics of this simple and short love song, a song recorded by just 2 of the band members, with the drummer on lead vocals. Asked about the song featuring just 2/5 of the band, Hackett says, "It was fine because it gave a different atmosphere again. It was a nice dynamic compared to everything else, it was completely different. It was a love song and I think it was a refreshing change from everything else. The idea of just a guitar and a voice with the occasional harmony is good. It's a bit like on Foxtrot when I played Horizons on my own. It provides the same function, the picture empties out and becomes very peaceful, so silence comes into play. The idea of a song like this works as a miniature amongst most of the other songs which are epics. This and I Know What I Like are the two brief moments and they work as light relief, almost like something to clean the palate between courses, and it's in a style which would become very familiar with Phil Collins. Side B, Song First, The Battle of Epping Forest. A complex song, and the longest on the album at over 12.5 minutes, driven by the incessant organ and Rickenbacker bass, while Tony uses the synthesizer in some passages and where the falsetto vocals in the choruses are provided by Philosophy. Various elements are reprised and intertwined to create a musical fabric with sometimes less than convincing results. Hackett, I don't think it's a totally successful song. I think maybe other people in the band might regard it as a total failure. I think Phil would because there are so many sections and it's so complicated. Yet it's a very simple idea. Perhaps it should have been done much more simply to reflect the lyrical content, but then again you've got a rhythm section trying to be very clever with rhythms, so it means you've got more punctuation. Then statement. It's a criticism that I would level at most progressive rock. In progressive rock, especially among the new purveyors of the genre, there is a tendency to think that it should sound like this, you shouldn't be able to tap your foot to it. This was a style that Phil was using at the time. Rhythmically the drums are working in counterpoint to the mainstream of the music. It parallels the approach that was being used by Bill Bruford. I sense a tremendous influence of Yes in the rhythm section with this song. The march at the beginning of the song is very bizarre. Hackett, the beginning is mellotron flute and the marching feet of the soldiers is done with the guitar using a fuzz box, an octave divider and an echo, so it's doubling on itself and sounds like multiple echoes. You had to play in time with the echo, which never worked in America because the voltage was different, so the echo speed would come back too fast. At the end of the first part, 4 minutes and 3 seconds, there is another guitar section played with repeat echo. Hackett, as a guitar sound I'm very proud of it because it almost predates reggae playing. This is what reggae is all about, this idea of playing in time with echoes. Maybe no reggae band had ever heard it, but it was the same use of technology. Just this little section predates reggae in the same way that The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway predates punk, in the same way that the use of tapping predates the whole orientation towards that by American guitarists. It is a particularly adventurous track with, according to Hackett, contrary rhythms the whole time, 5 against 2, a drum polyrhythm and lots of other things going on as well, like the hand claps which sound like Spanish flamenco, whereas in the chorus it's all straight 4/4, Hackett explains, but with the bass doing contrary time signatures. The drum work is all punctuation. Most modern drummers would just go bass, drum and snare. Nobody does that anymore unless you're a prog band, of course. There's a very clever moment, but it's swing with accent, so it really comes from the Buddy Rich jazz school approach. Whether Phil was aware of them or not I don't know, but he reminds me of a drummer who worked with Miles Davis, Jack DeJohnette, when they were playing bebop. The real problems arose when Gabriel recorded the vocals. Collins, The Battle of Epping Forest is a classic example of what had happened previously on Ken Utility and the Coastliners and Get 'Em Out by Friday. We were writing it and we had some really good counter-polyrhythmic bits happening, and then Peter took the song and wrote the lyrics. Then he came in to sing the lyrics and there were like 300 words a line. There was no space, it was like all the air had been sucked out of it. I'm not saying that he was in the wrong or we were in the wrong, it's just that if we'd known we could have thinned it out a bit. In those days we didn't go back and re-record things. It was a classic example of when stuff got a little bit out of hand. Banks, it's a great backing track and it's a great vocal, but the two together at times do conflict. Having said that, it's a fun track. I mean, it's a lovely idea of this gangland warfare. It gave a lot of scope for Pete to put on his voices and everything. And it worked quite well live. Gabriel took his inspiration for the extremely lengthy set of lyrics, which are very descriptive, full of double meanings, allegories, and word play, from a newspaper article on the territorial battles of two rival gangs in London's East End. Hackett, the words are very funny with very funny English puns and the nuances are very English, of course. Gabriel, I'd spent a lot of time, you know, building up the story with all these characters and setting scenes, and I was quite reluctant to edit as severely as I should have done. So I think it did end up too wordy. The groove didn't really work on that particular take. If I were to do it now, I'd maybe slow it down a little and speed it up at the end, try and get a punchier undercarriage. Musical conflicts aside, Gabriel's vocal interpretation is nothing short of outstanding. For example, in the part where he impersonates the vicar, 5 minutes and 28 seconds. Hackett, I think you have to be English to understand what Pete's doing here. He's doing an impression of an English churchman, a vicar, and the way vicars tend to pronounce their A's, typical of the way a certain class of churchmen would preach their sermons in this very superior sort of way. There is a chord sequence here that Tony came up with on guitars which for me didn't work. Then Pete came up with this thing which made it into a totally humorous statement. It was like a woman in clothes that are frumpy and very unsexy, a turn-off for men, that almost made her into a transvestite. Side B, song second, After the Ordeal. Despite what the title may appear to imply, this instrumental has nothing to do with the battle described in the previous song. Hackett, I can't remember if it was intentional to place it after the Battle of Epping Forest. I just thought that was the kind of title that might dissipate all the tensions in the rest of the album. After the Ordeal was supposed to be the equivalent of today's chill music. After all that, you get something simple, again this idea of light and shade. A track written by Steve where he is also the main player on his guitars, his nylon in the initial section and electric later on. Hackett, it was really designed as an electric tune, but for some reason we couldn't make it work. It could have just been a section in another electric song, but we didn't manage to do that, so we were not going to record it. Then in the studio, Tony came up with his part and on the spot we decided to switch it to an acoustic tune where I would play the electric line on the nylon guitar instead. This was the first time the nylon started to creep into Genesis music, both here and with the return of the theme on Isle of Plenty. The song caused a lot of arguments in the band. Banks, I really don't like, I've never liked it, and I would have liked it not to have been on the album. In the end, we compromised by putting everything we had on the album. Hackett, I know Tony hates it and thinks it's the worst thing that Genesis ever did. I could point out many other moments that I think are a lot weaker, but, as a diplomat, I won't. All I can say is that in Cinema's show I think the keyboard solo is far too long. There was a contest as to whether we were going to let the keyboard solo be on the album or not. Pete didn't want it on. Other people didn't want After the Ordeal on. We were all fighting each other, we were all emphatic that we wanted our ideas on. I think this was a new dynamic for the band, because I don't think they were used to me coming on as strong as them. I was thinking, fuck it, this is a really strong guitar album and I don't want to have it diminished just because someone else thinks their part is more important. The part where the electric guitar comes in, 2 minutes and 12 seconds, was written by Mike. Hackett, I thought it was nice for the electric guitar to come to the fore. I felt that I had a real job to do in that band at the time and they were good memorable melodies. They could all of them be played better now, of course, in time and in tune. I can criticize this song and I can also praise it, I think Mike's is a lovely melody and I think this album would have been weaker had it been excluded. In the closing section, a twisting lead guitar, 3 minutes and 13 seconds, reaches an emotional peak before the song's conclusion where a magical touch of flute from Gabriel leads it up to fade. Hackett, this is a lovely melody that I wrote and it's my melody at the end 3 minutes and 19 seconds. The guitars are dubbed with harmony and then everyone did their improvisation around it. Side B, Song 3rd, The Cinema Show. This is a musical opera which is clearly divided into two parts. The first is an acoustic song written by Mike Rutherford, the second is a drawn-out instrumental part written and played by the trio, Banks, Collins, and Rutherford. Rutherford, speaking in 2007, normally, you've got 12 strings and they're paired up and you tune each pair to the same note. I started tuning each pair to harmony notes, which is how the song starts with that sort of rundown. Now, I haven't got a clue what the hell the tuning is. The other day, in New York, they were saying, "Oh, let's do the first half of Cinema Show, maybe," and I said, "I've no idea how I played it." You have to work a compromised version out. Hackett, now I've come to enjoy this song very much, but at the time I didn't feel it was strong. I realize it's very much a people's favorite, they like it very much and I've tried to understand why. I think it's probably because it's very romantic. It has a lot of sections in it and a lot of good bits, but I wouldn't necessarily say the actual song is the strongest bit of it. But it did work very well live. The initial structure includes two 12 strings, played by Mike and Tony, with Steve adding the finishing touches on his electric guitar. Hackett, I was trying to make my guitar sound like Ian MacDonald's flute, almost like a woodwind instrument, creating melodic phrases. In the introduction there were two guitars playing, one is at regular speed and one is at double speed. It were chorded at half speed and played back so that it comes back higher. So you hear a very high-sounding 12-string and then a very sweet one above it. The first two verses are followed by a long acoustic interlude made up of various instrumentation 2 minutes 45 seconds and a two-voice vocal melody without words. Hackett, Pete played oboe and flute. Phil played wood blocks, while Mike and Tony were playing 12 strings. Tony used to put his through the Leslie cabinet to give it a very cloudy sort of sound. I used to do that with my electric guitar as well. The semi-improvised vocal part, 4 minutes and 5 seconds, in counterpoint was very clever melodically. It's a lovely melody, something Crosby, Stills and Nash could have sung. Only, if they had sung it, I think it probably would have sounded better. When the arpeggio returns, with the drums coming in, 4 minutes and 35 seconds, if you listen carefully to the 12-string parts, says Hackett, you'll notice there are lots of missed notes. The first part closes on a short solo, 5 minutes and 25 seconds. Hackett, guitar and synthesizer playing together. I was using a fuzz box and passing the guitar through the Leslie cabinet again. Banks, it sounds wonderful in 5.1, especially the first part, the way the guitars and voices sort of come in and out is really good. Sometimes with 5.1 the best thing is being able to position the guitars all over the place, often in our songs there were 3 of us playing guitar. The instrumental section of the song, played by the trio Tony, Mike, and Phil is completely different. Collins, it was obviously a song in 2 halves and it was even rehearsed separately. Probably, with the recording, Tony went in there and fooled around, but it was based on a 7/8 guitar riff and drum thing, something which we still do to this day. Rutherford, we, myself, Phil and Tony, started the second part. I'm not excluding Steve, but it was more about us just jamming together, getting these instrumental moments like this one and the back end of 9/8 and Suppers Ready, which became a large part of our trademark. It was a great live song and that instrumental part was a huge crowd pleaser. In a sense, it was frustrating when Peter left because the audience didn't know that some of their favorite live sections, like Cinema Show, weren't actually written by Peter. They tended to think that the singer wrote everything. It was in the live set for a long while because we were sort of saying, if only you knew that a lot of the stuff you liked before was actually written by the guys who are still here, but, of course, we wrote in the credits all the songs by Genesis, so you couldn't tell people that. Hackett, it was tremendous playing by Phil, but, as he said, in those days the drums were the only instrument that wasn't overdubbed, whereas there was a chance to overdub the keyboard parts and fix them. He had to accept a take that was done when he was really tired and he wouldn't be happy in the end because he'd end up playing safe. Even so, this is very good drumming. On the other hand, I think the synth solo goes on too long. It's a very lovely melody, especially when the mellotron and voices kick in 7 minutes and 29 seconds. Live it was great because it used to shake the Foundation's bass pedal, choir, melody. As a trio they sounded huge. I think the 7/8 bit finds focus and becomes melodic and memorable. I far prefer it to all the widdly up and down stuff that comes before it. But then again, I can't criticize my playing on this because I'm not playing on it. Banks, the instrumental at the end was probably the best one we did at this stage of our careers. Mike had this riff in 7/8 which just went dang 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 and he'd just be playing along. So we put all this together and I just improvised for hours and got all the little bits and pieces going. We changed the chords and we ended up with this piece and I think it has such a strong rhythm. A lot of things you play on it could be really good, but I got 1 or 2 quite good melodies on top of it and it built up to a very nice climax. It was probably better on stage than it is on the album in many ways, because on the album it fades out into the next bit which I'm not too sure is quite so good. It was an exciting thing to create at the time and we were very pleased with it. The funny thing about it was, when Tony Stratton-Smith heard the album, he didn't like that part. He thought we were trying to do something different and that we should stick with what we knew best. But we were very convinced that this should go on the album, so we stuck to our guns. You look at it now and realize that to have left that off the album would have been a bit of tragedy really. Towards the end of the long galloping synthesizers, the chords become major 9 minutes 42 seconds. Hackett, I like this very much, I like it when the mellotron strings kick in. It's a real up, the band starts to sound like an orchestra again, and I'm always relieved when it sounds like an orchestra or a choir. When it's ego-driven pyrotechnic playing, frankly I think it's a sport that I've heard others do better. The song slows down for a final synth riff 10 minutes and 30 seconds which, surprisingly enough, was the drummer's idea. Hackett, Phil had this riff on keyboards and we always tried to do it as another song. It was going to be another sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash influenced thing but we never did it, we just used a bit in Cinema Show. The lyrics were written by Tony and Mike, the first part clearly inspired by T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. Gabriel, I don't think I had much to do with the lyrics, it was very much Mike and Tony's song, although it became sort of band thing as it took off. Although he had some good ideas, there were some things Tony would come up with that I would just refuse to sing, because the sound of the words and how you put them together is as important as the meaning. At times I felt lumbered and at other times really comfortable and liked the pictures being built. As time went on, I realized I did a better job when I'd written stuff or when I felt very comfortable with the lyrics. I could sing other people's lyrics if I thought they were really great and well balanced. I got that sometimes with the others in the band but probably only 50% of the time. There were 1 or 2 things I wasn't 100% on. And then, of course, Phil had exactly the same experience when he had to sing my lyrics. There is such a thing as karma. In the live shows, when the instrumental part came along, Steve would leave the stage. Hackett, I know that Daryl Stuermer, Genesis post-77 session man used to play along to this when they did it live, but I decided to distance myself from it rather than just play the same thing as Mike. He didn't really want me to play along with him during that part and I was okay with that. There was already this orientation towards the trio, so I just let them do that. There are plenty of other great guitar moments on the album. I didn't feel the need to keep playing one note. For me, it would have just been a repetitive strain injury. In recent years, Hackett appears to have changed his mind as he does play on the instrumental part when the song is performed by his own live band. Banks, it was very popular live. It just sounded very good, particularly in later years when we had the double drummers, first of all, Bill Bruford and then with Chester Thompson. It was always a very, very strong moment, very driving, which is interesting really because it's in 7/8. But it sounds so natural that you're not really aware that it's in a funny time signature. As a keyboard player it's quite interesting because it gives you scope to try funny things, most of the time you play with it, without really thinking about it, but at other times you can actually construct things in 7/8, playing on top to see what happens. Some of that worked really well, so it was quite a fun thing to do. Side B, Song 4th, Isle of Plenty. The closing track acts as a coda to Cinema's show and reprises other parts of the album. It picks up from where the previous track slows down to its conclusion before flowing into Hackett's classical guitar riff taken from Dancing with the Moonlit Night, from which it also inherits the melody sung by Gabriel. Isle of Plenty is the perfect conclusion to the album, both musically and in terms of the very short lyrics, full of double meanings and word play, with an odd reference to supper's ready, it's scrambled eggs, which answers the question of what will be for supper. Gabriel, this song was the back bookend. Using the same melodies and harmonies that I'd written at the front on Dancing with the Moonlit Night. At that point, it was full of these tarmac and supermarket images. It was what had happened to England. Hackett, Pete's singing at the end, the impression of supermarkets I find very clever, especially in terms of the lyrics because it's all a play on words. When it says Tesco operates, for example, Tess is a woman's name and at the same time it sounds like Tesco, which is a supermarket chain. So it's a combination. It could either be the woman or it could be the supermarket. The nuances of language are used very well on this. It's an album John Lennon said he liked. He used to listen to this in New York and, without doubt, all this play on words, when the various voices at the end are on top of each other, was influenced by Lennon and the Beatles. The album artwork.
After 3 albums characterized by the wonderful paintings of Paul Whitehead, the band decided on a change for this album. However, they were not drawn to the idea of featuring photographs of the band for the cover image. Gabriel, we were quite obsessive about that. Me in particular, I think about trying to have images do the talking rather than mugshots of the band. Instead, they were attracted to the work of an English artist, Betty Swanwick. Rutherford, I just like seeing stuff. You know, when you see an image and say, that's the cover, or let's develop that. I prefer seeing things and saying, that's it, rather than commissioning things because you spend a long time waiting for a drawing or painting and then maybe you get it and you don't like it. Betty Swanwick was a great artist. She was a great old lady and it was nice having someone who wasn't from the music world but from the art world. This was the first time without Paul Whitehead. I think that the Foxtrot album cover was a bit weak, so it was time to change and move on. Collins, for me, it was a great cover. It showed that there had been a change of sorts, you know, from that kind of almost schoolboy graphics we had on Foxtrot and Nursery Creme to something with Betty's characters which was kind of elegant. Banks, Peter said, why don't we get a real artist? So we went to the Royal Academy and looked around and we saw this picture which we thought was great. So we went and had tea with this fantastic lady. We had tea in her garden, but what was great was that she just put the table on the lawn, and when she put the tea on it, everything was sort of sliding down the thing. And the whole time we were there was this parrot sat on Peter's shoulder, sort of nibbling his collar. It was a somewhat surreal moment. Anyhow, she was a reasonably old lady and she said, she'd love to do it the album cover but that she couldn't do anything from scratch in just a month, which is what we needed. So we asked if she could modify the picture she already had. And that is what she did. She just took the picture she had and she added a lawnmower to it, so that it fitted with the lyrics of I Know What I Like, and some people in the background. It worked really well and in many ways it's the best piece of art we've ever had on a front cover. Whether it's the best cover or not, I don't know, but it's the best piece of art on a cover. I've got the original at home, I'm glad to say, it's a lovely piece. Gabriel, I'd seen this artist, Betty Swanwick, at a Royal Academy show. She seemed to have a good combination of Englishness while exposing the underbelly. I went down to see her with Tony and Margaret, Tony Banks' wife. She had a parrot and she kept on talking to the parrot in the middle of the conversation, so you weren't quite sure if you were being addressed or the parrot. And then she'd say, right, let's swap chairs, so you'd swap over. When she heard some of the things I was thinking about with the lyrics, she wanted to add a leather glove to the painting or sketch that she'd already done. I can't remember now if it was a drawing or a painting originally. She was a wonderful woman, a little bit like Miss Marple or an Agatha Christie character. Full of life, very smart and mischievous. She added the lawnmower because I had this line in a song, me, I'm just a lawnmower, you can tell me by the way I walk. Again, I think it was the sense of the actor mowing the lawn, a way for people to clear some of the angst. I don't want to upset anyone, but this album cover was better than some that had gone before. Hackett, Betty said she would work on this black and white thing we had seen over and over again and do it in color. So we had this great artist doing this cover and I think it was perfect for the type of music, it was English, it was eccentric, it was gardens. It was dreamlike and it's a great work of art in its own right. She's sadly no longer with us. I believe she employed a dry brush technique but, then again, I'm no expert so it may have been pencil and crayon. It was just beautiful and I felt the whole package worked. Epilogue. Selling England by the Pound was released in October 1973. In America, it never went higher than number 70 in the charts, but for the first time ever Genesis managed to make it into the UK Top 10 Albums chart with an impressive number 3 spot, making this the band's first major commercial success. Alongside the album, the single, I Know What I Like, spent 7 weeks in the charts, reaching number 21. Collins, it was another stage towards getting more confidence. There was a feeling that we'd finally gone somewhere, you know. We were still very much a road band, but we were learning the ropes in the studio. Gabriel, I think people were growing into themselves and getting to know their quirks and eccentricities so the personalities were easier to feel. There was a sense of, you know, look I can do this, and Steve definitely felt more of his own power in this record. Banks, the lineup was stable and it felt stable too. Phil and Steve had both very much found their feet in the group, particularly as players, with Steve even starting to write a little bit, although it was still quite early days for him really. It was a more integrated sort of thing, even though, in all honesty, it was probably still a case of 3 senior and 2 junior members, but that was changing as time went by. Hackett, I think of this album as quintessentially English, it's like English fusion before the term was invented. Or even English collusion you could say, because it's too many different styles of music put side by side. I don't think Genesis or any modern band would be capable of making this now because they would be too frightened of failure. A modern band won't take a chance of making an album like Sgt. Pepper's. Even the Beatles were terrified that Sgt. Pepper's was going to be above people's heads. When we played this album to Tony Stratton-Smith, he said, "I don't like it, but we'll put it out anyway." He didn't think it was as strong as Foxtrot, but then again I thought it was an album with lots of great, wacky ideas and lots of guitar moments that work. Rutherford, I've always likened Selling England by the Pound to Nursery Creme, they are sort of similar feeling albums in my mind. I think the good bits are good and the bad bits are a bit dodgy. But I think there are definitely some strong bits in there. And, of course, our first semi-hit single. Hackett, I think albums like this provided a bridge over the chasm between what rock music was and what pop music was. The whole thing was a huge experiment. I think it's very English and not always an act of genius, it's very much a bunch of guys all forcing their ideas through and sticking to their guns, and that's why there are times when it's an uncomfortable mix. Everyone was being strong on it, and that's what I like about it. I think everyone plays, sings, and writes with conviction, saying no, my idea is as important as anyone else's. I still maintain that it's my favorite Genesis album because I felt most at home there. It was the life raft that I clung to at a time when I was operating in a stormy sea in my own private life. When I was working with them, I really felt that I was playing in the world's best band. When we were playing in America, particularly in Los Angeles at the Roxy, where we couldn't get a gig anywhere else, I felt that those shows in front of a small audience were some of the finest we ever did, and I felt completely at home. When I was on stage playing this material, I felt as though I had the world of music in my hands. I felt that we were head and shoulders above everybody else at that time. There wasn't a band on the face of the earth that could do jazz moments like that, and improvisation and cohesive arrangements and humor and little bits from classical music and hymns side by side with this kind of clever mathematical punctuated drumming. Banks, on this album I think we came together much more as players. It was the first one where we sound really convincing, there's a bit more technique in there. However, I always like to think that technique is just another sort of paintbrush, something you can use and it can be very effective at times, but it should never take over. I think with some groups it sort of takes over, you get a guitarist who can play so fast that he can't stop doing it and everything, whereas we're very happy to sort of sit down. I'm just very happy to sit down and hold chords, which I do a lot of the time. Then other times you can go mad and the contrast works, it illustrates something you are trying to create with the piece of music you're writing. Collins, speaking frankly, my problem at that time was that we weren't a groove-oriented band. I was desperately trying to bring in my roots of Motown and Atlantic and sort of soul music into this thing that was very, very English. Sometimes it just didn't happen, but at this point we were still struggling to sort of stay in time. Gabriel, there were things I was less happy with than others, and obviously I think everyone was trying to follow their own bits and pieces further through than anyone else's. Some things could have been a bit sharper. For example, the chorus of I Know What I Like, which for me didn't last as a pleasurable experience, even though it got us a hit. Most of our stuff took a few plays for a listener to open up to it, but once they got it, it would stick around for quite a long time. The old school allegiances had broken down quite a long time before really, and I think Phil and Steve were on an equal footing in terms of power broking. Banks, this album was sort of commercially a success. I think that the odd light bit did help. Suddenly it started getting played on the radio a bit. I think what happened was that with the live shows we were picking up new fans all the time, so when the album came out, suddenly there were a lot of people going out and buying it all at the same time. That gave us a bit of chart presence. It came in at number 3 or something and stayed there for the second week, and then suddenly it was down at 25, but it still made us feel that we had got somewhere. Gabriel, I think I started to have some frustration about not being part of the keyboard side of things. I have very strong ideas on how things should sound and how you mix things together, so I think there may have been some frustrations in that department. There was a little riff on I Know What I Like which I played, and there was a big battle to persuade Tony to let me play that bit in the end. The keyboard part recorded by Gabriel was never used. He was very possessive and I think a little afraid it would be the thin end of the wedge. But you know, I was never interested in trying to take over keyboards. It was just that I think sometimes when other people play things they bring different personalities into it. It was just a question of getting these new colors. When we were out gigging, quite often there'd be a piano in one of the dressing rooms and it was always Phil and I who would be there, busy playing keyboards and singing our stuff, but then there wouldn't be any of that within the Genesis performance. So there was this mild frustration. It wasn't burning at me or pissing me off also. Because we were getting a lot of other stuff achieved and there was plenty to do. Heck it, it's only over time that you have the ability to focus on this and analyze why it worked. It's an album that's full of nuances and digressions and side alleys, little side streets that sometimes lead off and go nowhere. Nonetheless, it doesn't sound like any other album anyone else has ever done. Not even Genesis did another album that sounded like this. If I were to speak for Mike, Tony, and probably Pete, I don't think they would feel it's the strongest album because they would be thinking in terms of songs rather than atmospheres. I think this album is largely atmosphere driven because they weren't the greatest songs around. Although it sounds nothing like them, this record is in some ways closer in spirit to a Pink Floyd album. There were fewer ideas but there are more moments of allowing the music to run. I think the idea of why don't we just have a drone for a bit or just hit and knock bottles, was influenced by Eno talking about music that was drone driven. Drone music is ancient. It's Gregorian chant, it's hurdy-gurdy men doing their stuff, it's Greek Orthodox music and the music from the southern plains of Hungary, improvisations that have no fixed notes, no fixed point, it's very early use of two-note harmony. All I know is that the band went up a notch. And fans liked it better each time, so it seems. This was not an album that disappointed fans who enjoyed Nursery Creme or Foxtrot. And don't forget we were still working with the 12-string style at this time, which was hugely influenced by the genius of the young Anthony Phillips. I don't think he's given enough credit for architecting the sound of Genesis, and he was very important, almost like Matthew Fisher was for Procol Harum. I believe Anthony Phillips was for Genesis someone who cracked the whip, made them work harder and gave them a run for their money. The concerts. The band's performance at Reading Festival on August 26, 1973 officially brought the Foxtrot tour to a close. By this time they had already recorded the new album, Selling England by the Pound, which they were set to take out on the road in less than a month's time to coincide with its release. After the first tours, decidedly basic in terms of presentation, depending almost entirely on Gabriel's charisma and imagination, this time round the music was going to be accompanied by a first-rate stage show. The stage setup was dominated by the color white, the four musicians were dressed in white, the drum kit and part of the keyboards were white, and white light illuminated the whole scene. And that's not all. White, wavy curtains hung behind the musicians along with 3 screens on which slides were projected to create the right atmosphere for specific moments in the show. The set list for the first few gigs was, Watcher of the Skies, I Know What I Like, The Cinema Show, The Battle of Epping Forest, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, Firth of Fifth, The Musical Box, Supper's Ready with the return of the Giant Hogweed as an encore. This last song was played to please audiences who had no intention of leaving at the end of Supper's Ready, which the band considered to be the logical conclusion to their show. In fact, as early on as Lausanne, on September 29, the return of the Giant Hogweed was taken out of the set list to make room for More Fool Me, which usually came straight after the musical box. Shortly afterwards the band also changed the running order of the songs, moving the Battle of Epping Forest further down the set list and bringing Dancing with the Moonlight Night forward to become their second number. At this point, the set list became pretty much settled and normally included Watcher of the Skies, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, The Cinema Show, I Know What I Like, In Your Wardrobe, Firth of Fifth, The Musical Box, More Fool Me, The Battle of Epping Forest, Supper's Ready. This was a very different set list to the previous tour due to the considerable presence of new songs. All the tracks off the new album were included except After the Ordeal and Isle of Plenty. To make way for the new material, classics such as Get 'Em Out by Friday and The Knife were dropped, although the latter did occasionally reappear as an encore. Even though the set list was largely settled, occasionally there would be some variations. For example, Harold the Barrel from Nursery Creme would sometimes make an appearance, only once returning as an encore. More often than not it was added as a bonus in the second half of a concert. Another significant variation concerns Horizons, Hackett's acoustic guitar solo, which funnily enough had never been played during the Foxtrot tour, quite often appeared instead of More Fool Me, although sometimes both songs were played. The opposite also occurred, with neither of them being played, and occasionally the Battle of Epping Forest was also left out. This confirms an interesting trend which in all probability had something to do with Gabriel's by now overwhelming personality. With his increasingly predominant stage presence, the singer was, albeit involuntarily, beginning to overshadow his bandmates, something they didn't take too kindly to. Consequently, the band quite wisely decided to show their audiences that Gabriel was not the only shining star in the Genesis firmament and that it held four others of equal standing, even though they may have appeared to shine less brightly. So the group was frequently divided into different numerical entities. Hackett held the spotlight with his Horizons, while for More Fool Me drummer Phil took center stage to sing accompanied by Mike on the 12-string. Tony was allowed an opportunity to play solo on piano with his intro to Firth of Fifth, albeit for only a short while, starting from the English tour in January 1974, and the whole instrumental section of Cinema Show was played by Tony, Phil, and Mike, the trio which would characterize the second stage in Genesis' career. Musically speaking, the concerts were quite simply outstanding with the band on top form and, for the very first time, perfectly balanced. Rutherford once more proved to be the essential binding force with his great work on 12-string guitar and consistent use of the electric bass, often fed through a fuzz box, and making much use of his iconic Rickenbacker double-neck guitar, allowing him to move easily between bass and 12-string. Collins, by this time consolidated in his position as second vocalist, gave extraordinary performances with increasingly more complex drum scores, appearing with vibraphone, glockenspiel, tubular bells, and a vast array of other percussion instruments on stage. Bolstered by his improved studio performance, Hackett went on tour with his confidence at an all-time high, playing electric and acoustic guitar and occasionally a Danelectro sitar while all the time making the most of his Echoplex, a device which helped to bring out experimental sounds. There were still occasional missteps, however. On some, possibly all, shows on the tour, Hackett would play a strangely timed sequence of notes early in the solo on Firth of Fifth, which seemed at odds with the rhythm section. Genesis' most important player, though, was still Tony Banks, even more so now that he had better equipment. Although his primitive RMI electric piano left a lot to be desired, the short keyboard and lack of touch sensitivity was so inadequate as to affect his playing, with him frequently getting the notes in the intro to Firth of Gabriel in concert. San Francisco, March 24, 1974. Fifth wrong. Having an ARP Pro soloist synthesizer definitely made his life much easier when playing his solos and especially in the long instrumental section of Cinema Show. But, Despite the undeniable high caliber of the four main instrumentalists, the absolute star of the show was still Gabriel, with a voice that had reached full maturity and playing some very pleasant flute. Peter continued to capture the audience's attention with his charisma and further developments in his stage costumes. While Watcher of the Skies and Suppers Ready continued to be performed with the ingenious presentation ideas used in the previous tour, albeit with a few adjustments, the addition of gloves and cape for the former, Gabriel brought in some other theatrical elements to accompany songs from the new album, in particular for Dancing with the Moonlit Night, My Name is Britannia, he would tell the audience, proudly wearing a helmet, cape, and shield painted with the Union Jack. Slightly less picturesque but still evocative were his various interpretations for the Battle of Epping Forest, including a vicar and a thug wearing a stocking mask over his head, and the lawnmower man complete with an ear of wheat in his mouth for I Know What I Like. But possibly Gabriel's greatest theatrical moment came at the end of the musical box. After the long instrumental interlude, Peter would walk back onto the stage, hunched over and wearing a mask of an old man. After a series of unambiguous hip-thrusting movements to act out the precociously aged Henry's desire to possess his nursery playmate, Cynthia, he would fall to the ground as if exhausted. Added to this, Gabriel continued to invent surreal stories which he would tell before songs, like his take on Romeo and Juliet before cinema show, the description of 5 Rivers for Firth of Fifth, the rather disturbing story of the girl on the tube, written on the back of the Genesis live album sleeve, or the story of old Michael before Supper's Ready, this sometimes with a little help from Phil on drums. The Selling England by the Pound tour included around 120 shows, running from the second half of September to the beginning of the following May, with just a couple of short breaks, for Christmas and in the second half of February. A handful of concerts in Europe, the first at the legendary Olympia in Paris followed by a few shows in Germany, gave the band a chance to musically shape the new songs before they started out on the first UK tour made up of 15 or so dates. The first, Glasgow, October 5th, was, unfortunately hit by critical electrical issues and after the support act, Ron Jeeson, finished his performance, Genesis were forced to postpone the show until the night of the October 9th. Towards the end of the tour, 31st October, Genesis spent 2 days at Shepperton Studios, Surrey, where, in front of a small audience of technicians, roadies, and fans, the promo film Tony Stratton Smith Presents Genesis in Concert was made. Increasingly better quality copies of this roughly 1-hour concert, with the following set list: Watcher of the Skies, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, I Know What I Like, The Musical Box, Supper's Ready, would start to appear in fans' collections in the 80s, and it was finally officially released as part of the bonus material in the 2008 remastered version of Selling England by the Pound. At around the same time, the band renewed their request to Tony Smith, already famous for having worked alongside his father with bands such as the Beatles, The Who and Led Zeppelin, to become their manager. After declining the previous year, when he limited himself to organizing the UK tour for February, Smith accepted, starting with the North American tour, which was much more comprehensive than the previous rather timid approach and ran throughout November and December. After a few days rehearsing at the beginning of November at the Cap Rouge College in Quebec City, the tour kicked off in Canada, not without the odd setback. The concert on November 8 in Toronto went ahead without a light show as the equipment had not arrived in time. Tackling the East Coast with determination, some of their concerts were in high-status venues, such as the Tower Theatre just outside the city limits of Philadelphia, the Feld Forum in New York, although most of them were still part of the college circuit. Genesis then ended the year by moving over to the West Coast for 6 concerts, 2 each day, in Los Angeles on 17, 18, and December 19, For the last show, Gabriel went on stage dressed up as Father Christmas and inhaling helium so he could talk with a funny voice. The Roxy wasn't a very large venue, but Genesis managed to fill it with enthusiastic audiences for all 6 shows. Before returning home, the band managed to film a TV appearance for NBC, which was aired on January 25 as part of the show Midnight Special. They played Watcher of the Skies and a slightly abridged version of the musical Box, complete with a series of Gabriel costume changes. But, although their fame was slowly starting to spread, Genesis didn't exactly make things easy. In fact, when they were invited to appear on Top of the Pops, unhappy with the results, they rejected the film prepared for I Know What I Like, forcing the BBC to air the song, which had entered the charts, accompanied by a Pan's People dance routine. 1974 began with another series of UK dates. After the concert in Birmingham, Genesis had 3 dates planned for the Theatre Royal Drury Lane in London, which would then become 5 to meet the enormous demand for tickets. These concerts in the British capital were the scene for Gabriel's umpteenth theatrical feat. At the end of Supper's Ready, almost invisible steel wires hoisted him into the air as if he were flying. After a few dates in Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland, Genesis went back to Italy at the beginning of February for 4 concerts in Turin, Reggio Emilia, Rome, and Naples. The band's success was huge and was reported back home in Melody Maker, which published the amazing, and quite possibly slightly exaggerated, results of the tour organized by David Zerd: 10,500 spectators in Turin, 12,000 in Reggio Emilia, 20,000 in Rome and 11,000 in Naples. A total of 53,000 tickets sold at a time when Genesis, despite their increasing popularity, were anything but stars on home turf. These concerts would long be remembered for the band's absolutely incredible performances, with their loyal Italian fans being rewarded with the knife as an encore at all 4 venues and a rare performance of Harold the Barrel in Reggio Emilia. Before a brief break, Genesis played a couple of shows in France, stopping off in Paris on February 12 to record a live performance of I Know What I Like and Supper's Ready at the ORTF television studios. This appearance on the TV show Melody was recovered by enthusiasts many years later and was finally released as part of the bonus material of the 2008 remastered version of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. March and April were dedicated entirely to the United States. Genesis were set on extending their fan base on the other side of the Atlantic without giving second thoughts to the organizational effort required nor to the amount of traveling it would involve. As well as touring both the East and West Coasts, the group set about penetrating the interior states, those which were much more attached to tradition and therefore less open to the very European, nay, English, music offered by Genesis. So the band headed into Missouri and Iowa, into states along the Canadian border, Minnesota, Michigan, and into the Deep South, Texas, Georgia, even though the most acclaimed shows were obviously those in Philadelphia, where Gabriel once more flew during the performance of Supper's Ready, only this time almost strangling himself in the wires, New York, Chicago, and Cleveland. The U.S. tour in spring 1974 brought with it, among other things, a visual innovation. The scene, which had previously been characterized by the color white, this being the dominant color of the instruments, and the big back cloth, with 2 round screens on which slides were projected, had turned black. The last concert was scheduled for May 4 at the Academy of Music in New York. The massive enthusiasm shown by fans in the Big Apple meant another show was added for the following day. Unfortunately, however, during the night, 6 guitars were stolen. The band moved the repeat show to May 6 to give them time to recover some of their instruments, upon payment of a ransom, and hire others. And at the end of Supper's Ready, Gabriel flew through the air on metal wires one last time. Notes. 1. Mike Kaufman's Genesis Interviews, Chicago, London, October 2007, partially used in the bonus disc accompanying the 2008 remasters. 2. Mario Giametti listens to Selling England by the Pound with Steve Hackett, Twickenham, January 27, 2008. 3. Mario Giametti listens to The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway with Tony Banks, Chiddingfold, May 10, 2011.